This is Ron Kelleher with the Inspired Leadership Podcast, episode number 568. Today's episode is entitled, Will You Surrender to God? 3 important questions to ask yourself.
Hello, and welcome to Inspired Leadership, the podcast for Christian leaders in the marketplace who want to be the best leaders they can be. And now your host, Ron Kelleher.
As a child, I was mesmerized by the portrayal of Moses in the Ten Commandments. Seated in the family car at a drive-in theater, my eyes widened as Charlton Heston, staff in hand, brought the miracles of the Exodus to life. Moses' staff, this symbol of power and divine intervention, rooted itself in my imagination. It resurfaced during a recent profound moment when Pastor Rick Warren expounded on Exodus 4, presenting the staff as more than a tool. He said it represented Moses' identity, income, and influence. A mere shepherd's staff in human hands, it morphed into a conduit of wonders when surrendered to God. Reflecting on this, I recognized a parallel in our lives, particularly as Christian leaders. We grip onto our identities and livelihoods while swaying over others, much like Moses held his staff. But what transformation awaits when we loosen our grasp and place our trust in God's hands? This narrative, ingrained from a young age, gained significance as I pondered Pastor Warren's insights and revisited Exodus chapter 4, verses 1 to 5. Here, the transition of a simple shepherd's staff into a vessel for the divine raises compelling inquiries about our leadership today. First, Pastor Rick said, the staff represents our identity. What is our identity? Well, Moses was a shepherd by trade. He held a staff that signified his past and his profession. God's command to cast it down was an invitation to surrender his identity to the divine's will. As Christian leaders, are we prepared to lay our titles at the feet of God, embracing our true identity found in him? Next, it represents our income. Moses' staff was also a symbol of his wealth, as prosperity in those times was often counted in livestock. By surrendering his staff, Moses demonstrated unwavering faith in God's provision. In modern times, this challenges us to trust God with our finances, acknowledging that our security is not in material wealth, but in the riches of our faith. And finally, third, it represents our influence. A staff directed the sheep, mirroring Moses' influence over his flock. Upon relinquishing his staff, Moses surrendered his control, allowing God to steer his path. As leaders, our influence can forge paths for others. But true leadership emanates from submission to God's greater vision. In essence, Moses' staff was a mere object until he surrendered it to God. Accordingly, God calls us to emulate this act of faith, particularly in leadership. What do we clutch in our hands? Our identities, our incomes, our influence, Are we willing to surrender them to God? Doing so allows the ordinary to become extraordinary under God's direction. Therefore, let us release our staffs with faith in the miracle maker, the one capable of drawing water from stone and parting the seas. Well, that's it for this week, and as always, questions and comments are welcome. Of the 3 questions, what is your identity, what is your income, and what is your influence, which do you find hardest to surrender to God? I'd love it if you'd come over to the website at ronkelleher.com/episode 568 and leave me a question or a comment. And as always, before we go, I'd like to ask you to do me a quick favor, and that is to hop on over to whatever podcast service you're listening to this on. Leave a ranking for the show and a comment if you wish. It really does help us get the show into the hands of more and more people. So I thank you in advance for that and pray that God would help us all to be the powerful and the inspired leaders He intends us to be. That's it for this episode of Inspired Leadership. You'll find a complete transcript of this episode on my website at www.ronkelleher.com. My prayer now is that you'll go out and be the powerful, inspired leader that God intends us to be.
Thanks for listening to the Inspired Leadership Podcast at www.ronkelleher.com.